1970s. So please join us for that as well. It's a great pleasure to introduce Amy Stambach. Amy Stambach is the author of two extraordinary and richly ethnographic books on education in Africa. The first of these books, Lessons from Mount Kilimanjaro, Schooling, Community, and Gender in East Africa, was published in 2000. What is crucial in that book is that schooling, and specifically secondary education for girls, is placed in the context of the surrounding community rather than studied as an institution apart from the community. As a result, Stambach succeeds in showing that schooling is less evenly and less continuously homogenizing than many overviews of schooling across societies expect to be the case. Instead, as she shows us, the people of the Machame district in Tanzania in the 1990s, when she did her ethnographic work, made schooling, classrooms, and textbooks into very particular aspects of their own lives. More generally, Lessons from Mount Kilimanjaro demonstrates that rather than schooling being an external vector of modernization, in Machame in the 1990s, secondary schooling for girls was instead a site at which collective notions of modernity and tradition were negotiated and constructed, with both global flows and local agency making a difference. Stambach's second book, Faith in Schools, Religion, Education, and American Evangelicals in East Africa, was published last year. Since her talk today is linked closely to this work, I will make only this brief observation, which is that what is both distinctly anthropological and powerful in the book is that it doubts the absoluteness of both secularism and religiosity, and thus resists assuming their polarization. Put simply, this is not a book that approaches secular and religion with a double standard of suspicion for one and sympathy for the other. Amy Stambach received a PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago and is today a professor of both anthropology and educational policy studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's a great pleasure to welcome her to speak with us today. Her talk is entitled Education and Evangelism in Africa, the Entry of Religious Knowledge into Secular Habits of Mind. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dan Siegel. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to join you on this Monroe Center for Social Inquiry series that you have. I also want to point out the title. I inserted an adjective, the American evangelism in Africa. I realize that my talk really could be as much about African evangelism as American evangelism, but in fact I'll focus on education and American evangelism in Africa, the entry of religious knowledge into secular habits of mind. Now, you may already think this is a huge topic. How are we going to even talk about this topic? But I assure you I will very quickly narrow it down. I will focus on what and how American evangelical missionaries teach when they work in public African schools. And my overarching argument will be that this first decade of the 21st century marks not the end of, but a high point in missionary involvement in international development work. The smaller role of governments, or the hollowed out role of governments, I should say, and the larger role of non-governmental organizations in providing social services in Africa, including public education, has created new spaces for religious groups to act. The kinds of religious groups that have moved into these spaces of governments are different, I argue, from the kinds of American and European ecumenical groups that served as missionaries in the 19th and much of the 20th centuries. Yesterday's groups were pluralistic and mainstream. They were open to working with many different kinds of religious communities, and I'm thinking in particular of the English Anglican Church, European and North American Protestant denominations, and Catholic missionaries, particularly the Puritans. Today's new groups, or the unique groups of today, I should say, by contrast, are increasingly coming from the United States, not Europe, and are a different slice of Protestantism. Today's new missionaries are characterized by a highly literalist or singular interpretation of the Bible, and, as some East Africans describe them, by a lack of tolerance for religious perspectives other than their own. These new and active American missionary groups are working in public settings, including in public African schools, clinics, and orphanages. African governments in general, and I'm overgeneralizing here a bit, but African governments in general embrace their work because these missionaries provide a free and skilled labor force. But in institutionalizing what they do, African governments and mission organizations partly undermine African independence and self-determination, which was the original goal of the post-colonial state. My argument then is that far from being irrelevant today, missionaries are at the heart of important political and economic changes occurring in Africa since independence. My more specific argument has to do with the operations of a particular faith-based English language program. And the program I'll tell you about involves missionaries from the United States working in several locations across East Africa. I'll argue from ethnographic evidence that American missionaries working in public schools infuse religious knowledge into students' lives indirectly, not by preaching or telling students what to think, but by organizing students' work in particular ways. Overall, I'll get this right. Overall, the work of American missionaries that I'm presenting here is not, I would argue, a lasting solution in Africa for providing mass education, nor does missionaries' work adequately substitute for government-sponsored education programs. Now, New York Times commentator a few years ago said, Nicholas Kristof said, that American evangelicals are America's new foreign policy force. And he's right in a way, yet as I will show through fieldwork evidence, the picture is more complicated than he tells it. And before I begin, please let me tell you a bit about my previous research, some of you may have read, or I understand have read, and then I'd also like to tell you the story behind my title, the subtitle, I should say. The subtitle is The Entry of Religious Knowledge into Secular Habits of Mind. I'll then share with you my framework for thinking about religion and education, and I'll then present some of my findings and discuss some of the implications of my work for current and future educational practices and policies. I first began working in East Africa in the early 1990s when I was a doctoral researcher studying private secondary schools, and I was interested at that time in understanding new opportunities these schools provided, particularly for girls living in rural areas. What I found, among other things, was that more girls than boys were attending these new secondary schools, and my research corrected, in part, a popular perception that schoolboys outnumbered schoolgirls in these rural areas. I published that work in 2000 in a book titled Lessons from Mount Kilimanjaro that Dan mentioned at the outset. And then I turned in my next project, which I see is outside in the lobby. I didn't realize the book was going to be out there. I turned to my next project, which is an examination of international development policy in East Africa. And this second project, the funding through the second project, I conducted a series of short-term field trips to East Africa between the years 2000 and 2006. That work resulted in the publication of this second book from which this talk draws. During a trip, what's a talk about a place without a map? So let me just quickly draw your attention to Tanzania on the coast there. During a trip to Tanzania in the year 2000, I came across a new group of American missionaries who were teaching English in public schools, not in private schools, as I had been familiar with over the years that I was working in the area. I was used to coming across American missionaries, and indeed the whole history of formal education across much of Africa is closely tied to the history of Christian missions. For example, one frequently sees old colonial-era churches built next to primary schools, and this is a slide of a church and mission school from the late 19th century. Both of these structures are still there, or I should say structures are very close to these buildings today, although in cement and wood form, and there's a mission hospital down the road that stands to this day. So there's a long history, of course, of mission work in connection with schools and health care and so on. But the group I encountered in 2000 was new to the area. These American missionaries were not from one of the long-established ecumenical groups, the Lutheran or the Presbyterian churches. This was a non-denominational evangelical group whose missionaries came from various independent congregations across the United States. The kind of work they were doing was different from other missionaries. They did not come to build traditional mission schools. They did not want to set up mission stations at all. Instead, they came to teach English in public Tanzanian government schools, schools such as the one in this photograph. The public nature of this group's work led me to reflect on a body of literature about American evangelism and the public work of American religious groups in social life. And so I'm going to sort of give you a little historical detour through some literature that leads to the title that the subtitle of my talk. Writing in 1848, you'll recall, in case you've read this, writing in 1848 about his 1831 field work in America, Alexis de Tocqueville described the sort of religious character of American people, and he used the phrase habits of the heart, or the mores that characterized the American people. Tocqueville noted that religious traditions directly informed American political and social involvement, and he singled out the family, way back in 1848, he singled out the family as the key social institution for shaping collective life. Tocqueville wrote, "The American derives from his own home that love of order which he afterward carries into public affairs." And Tocqueville lauded American women as the protector of morals and the moderators of restless men. About 60 years later, Max Weber wrote that a Protestant ethic influenced the development of capitalism in the United States. Weber argued that an ethic of personal salvation through the performance of good works influenced people to engage in secular projects. And he noted that some aspects of Protestantism gave positive meaning to worldly activities. To put this simply and to condense it, Weber showed or argued that Calvinist strains present in American traditions compelled individuals to pursue secular paths. Success in these pursuits was personal evidence, as Protestants saw it, of individual salvation and godly love. To take this a bit further and to get to this subtitle of mine, Robert Bellah in 1985 and his colleagues extended these themes of American family and religion in their book Habits of the Heart, Individualism and Commitment in American Life. Bellah and company maintained that American individualism was destroying American life and encouraged Americans to restore the dignity and legitimacy of democratic politics. So American missionaries of the 21st century, American missionaries' work of the 21st century is not exactly or not likely what Bellah and his colleagues had in mind. These missionaries see democratic politics as divinely made, not something that they, as humans, influence or create. Yet the conception of personal salvation and ideas about the family, about which Weber, Tocqueville, and to a lesser extent Bellah wrote, reverberates in these missionaries' present-day work. And this slide actually references some of the work that these same teams are doing in Latin America. Their work actually is all over the world, not only in Africa, but also parts of Latin America as well. This new wave of missionaries, or these evangelical American missionaries that my field research focused on, organized their churches around a two-parent monogamous family. And in fact, in the churches, both in the United States and in churches that these groups plant around the world, women teach and men preach, and there's a clear gender division within churches of various social roles, some of which these gender divisions don't sit well in local African communities. Many women would prefer to do much of the preaching, and so in contrast to some Pentecostal churches, these evangelical mission churches are seen as a little bit more staid and stoic and not as in tune with the social life of some African communities. Nonetheless, the idea of the church is that gender divisions are clear and not contestable. The church also forbids musical instruments during worship, and elders pray that the community should return to the simplicities of second century Christian life. In other words, this group of American missionaries espouses a view that the family serves as society's moral foundation and that religion is expressed through everyday simplicities, not trumpeted elaborately. The subtitle of my talk reflects these missionaries' conception that religious knowledge should be infused into secular habits of the mind. And of course, it picks up on what I see as one of the sub-themes of your series this semester, the entry of formalized knowledge into everyday habits of the mind. Some East Africans regard, I'll just hang on to this slide for a minute. Some East Africans regard this new wave of American evangelists as different from those American missionaries with whom they are familiar. Generally speaking, East Africans do not disparage evangelical missionaries' work, but rather note that the scale, quality, and numbers of American missionaries' projects in Africa and around the world has recently changed and grown. Their impressions that there are more and different kinds of American missionaries working in Africa and elsewhere is supported by research evidence. At the beginning of the 20th century, 62,000 missionaries worked worldwide. These are rough and ready figures, I'll admit. They're coming from Julie Hearn at the University of London, and they're correlated insofar as possible with the Evangelical Mission Information Society, who I'll reference toward the end of the talk. So at the beginning of the 20th century, roughly 62,000 missionaries worked worldwide, not only American missionaries, this is worldwide missionaries of all kinds working worldwide. By the end of the century, this number was about 5 times higher at 320,000. And for reference, the world population grew roughly 3-fold, not 5-fold during that interval. The fastest growing section of this global ministry, according to Julie Hearn at London and other sources, has been U.S. evangelicals. Between 2004 and 2007, the number of American evangelical churches in Africa increased 36%, from 361 agencies in 2004 to 492 agencies in 2007. In terms of funding, income for Protestant overseas missions specifically coming from the United States increased more than 79% between 1996 and 2005. It increased from estimated $2.9 billion in 1996 to over $5.2 billion US dollars in 2005. I'll continue with a few more rough and ready facts, that hopefully can give you an impression of some of these changes. In 1994, World Vision, a religious organization partly funded for some of its projects by the U.S. government through USAID, had a budget of $300 million. In 2007, World Vision had a budget of $752 million. To put these numbers in a bit of perspective, consider that the GDP of Eritrea in 1996, a country with a population of about 2.5 million people, the GDP of Eritrea in 1996 was estimated to have been $250 million compared to World Vision's budget of about $300 million at that time. So arguably, it's not a great exaggeration to say that some religious NGOs have as much money as some independent states. Some U.S. embassies, including that in Nairobi, Kenya, report that the greatest percent of Americans registered in their embassies are missionaries. Yet despite the clear presence and public visibility of American missionaries working in Africa, most of the scholarship that I'm familiar with, and I may not know everything about this, so please let me know if you know others, but most of the scholarship we have on religion in Africa has been about 19th century missionaries. Or I should say, the work we have not on religion in Africa is an anthropology very complex, and there's a rich literature on that, but scholarship on missionaries really has been about missionaries in the 19th century. This literature has focused on the Western impact on indigenous culture and the loss of African tradition in some regards. And this is an important story, to be sure, but little research has been conducted on contemporary missionaries, groups that are, as I have just shown, increasingly American, well-funded, and involved in public work. To address this gap, I carried out research in 4 countries on 2 continents. I worked in the United States and then also in Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda, so that the 3 countries right around Lake Victoria there. In the U.S., I focused on the training of missionaries, and I'm glad to address this topic in the Q&A. I visited and worked at Christian colleges who train and send students abroad to the specific sites where I conducted work in East Africa. And an interesting part of the book and part of the project I found was the ways in which missionary students study anthropology. At least in some ways they incorporate some ideas of anthropology into the work that they do. Glad to talk about that in the Q&A if that's of interest. So in East Africa, in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, I looked at what American missionaries do and at how Africans themselves see these missionaries. I observed evangelicals' activities in public primary schools. I met with East African officials and East African community members who are familiar with the mission work that these groups are doing. I conducted research at a Bible college in Nairobi where missionaries train African evangelists, and I analyzed mission textbooks and curricula to understand how world evangelism is conceptualized and taught through those media. I need to thank the governments of Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania for providing official permission for me to conduct research on this topic, and I also need to thank faculty and students at various Christian colleges who were generous and open with their ideas and time. What I found, to anticipate, and I'll show you this through a number of vignettes, but what I found was that many schools of faith played out in and through this evangelical group's work. In particular, I found that two kinds of faith emerged. One, what I think of as a secular modernist faith, that schooling, formal education, can and should change, ameliorate or reduce social inequalities and help move people out of poverty. I also found another kind of faith, a theological faith, if you will, that schools should be at the center of creating and educating a global world united, as this particular group saw it, through New Testament Christianity. So going into the project, I knew, this is really a crude slide, but it's a conceptual slide. Going into the project, I knew that religion and education are more closely related than is popularly or typically thought. During the interwar years of the early 20th century, right? Go back to the 20th century between World War I and World War II, and through at least the 1980s, education was seen by scholars, state leaders, and international agency representatives as a way to modernize and secularize underdeveloped communities, to put it bluntly. Right? Arguments about the modernizing power of education did not erase or discount the presence of religious belief, but relegated religion to the private sphere, separate from the realm of public policy, politics, economics, and science. Such views of secular education as the driving force of progressive and modern social change were integral to the rise of post-World War II international agencies and organizations that today provide the core of development aid internationally. And I'll give examples of this in just a second. In the US, we often, if I can generalize and maybe be a bit stereotypical, in the US we often have a sense that the two are separate, that religion is private, education is public. And we often believe that as people modernize, they become secular. Irrational beliefs fall away. Yet these ideas don't hold up empirically, nor even in many people's everyday lives. Religion has not gone away with greater doses of education. We see this, for example, in the US and Canada, where religion is a big part of public life and politics. We see it elsewhere in the world, and you likely can think of many examples. And we see a growing open presence of religion in international policies in recent years, including in UNESCO's Interreligious Dialogue Program and in the World Bank's Development Dialogue on Values and Ethics, both of which work through religious organizations to address poverty and which advocate and have started new programs in recent years to advocate for religious groups' involvement in public education programs. UNESCO's Interreligious Dialogue Program, for instance, describes itself as promoting discussion among different religions, spiritual and humanistic traditions. The World Bank Development Dialogue, originally founded in 2000 as the World Faiths Development Dialogue, describes its mission as alleviating poverty, and this is mostly in the third paragraph, I believe, alleviating poverty and combating social injustices by working with faith organizations, development institutions, philanthropists, and the private sector. This complex and often forgotten history of, I think often forgotten history, of the religious foundations of the liberal state and of the international policy frameworks that and development programs that grow out of it raises questions about today's world, a time when religious groups are making claims based on identity and equity for greater resources and representation within international agencies and nation-state programs. My conceptual framework for this project, then, is not that religion and secularism are separate, as Dan Siegel pointed out, not that one precludes the other, but that secularism is better viewed as the reorganization of religion with respect to social life. To put this another way, religion and education go hand in hand. The question is how and according to whom. If education is a matter of learning to embody a certain kind of knowledge, then surely contests over religion and education are not about whether but how religion and education are connected. They are about how to engage, what to embody, what to define, and of course, what to teach as orthodox and given. In East Africa, as elsewhere, the relationship between religion and education, or the constitution of these concepts, or even the constitution of these things as different concepts, is very complex. And I'd like to give you two brief examples of how religion and education go hand in hand in East Africa, independent of the work of these new American missionaries, and independent, to some extent, of development agencies. And I want to show you these East African examples for two reasons. One, so that we can see that what Tocqueville, Weber, and Bella, and many others have written about regarding the transposition of religious ideals onto secular life is not particular to secular life or to everyday life in the U.S. alone, but is manifest in unique ways elsewhere too. And I'd also like to show you these examples for a second reason, so that we can appreciate how this new, what I'm thinking of as this new wave of 21st century American missionaries, how their work resonates with very old and pre-existing ideas that go well beyond missionary involvement in Africa. So I'll give you these two examples, and then we'll move into what education programs these missionaries are involved in. So the first quick example is the teacher's prayer that appears in some public Tanzanian schools. In this particular school, the prayer is painted on a wall. Right next to, if you were to sort of look to the side of this, you would see a grammar lesson on Kiswahili noun classes. So this is a wall in a hallway in the school that sort of has lessons and statements painted right on the wall permanently. The prayer asks God to assist teachers in disciplining and educating students, and it equates, in the last sentence, it equates the work of teachers with the future of the nation. This kind of open prayer in public schools is not unusual. Teachers pray over morning tea and over afternoon lunch. They openly invoke God or Allah's greatness when they describe good and bad events. Yet if you look carefully at this teacher's prayer, you can see there is, I would argue, an implicit Christian or Protestant inflection to it in this public school. Dear Lord and Amen suggest a Christian orientation. The prayer does not mention Mungu or Allah and does not invoke other sorts of ritualistic turns of phrase that are associated, in this case, with Islam. As you might imagine, some communities, and particularly Muslims, object to this Protestant backdrop in public schools. But the historical association of colonial schools with Protestant missions from way back continues to be felt in these public settings. This first example then illustrates how, I would argue, how particular Protestant ideas are built into East African public schools. My second quick example goes deeper, if you will, than colonialism. It speaks to certain qualities of belief that have been felt by many people who have lived for many, and whose families have lived for many generations on and around Mount Kilimanjaro. Now you recall my work in East Africa focused on three areas. I'm looking here at the Tanzanian work. I also worked in Nairobi and Uganda, and toward the end I'll bring in some of that Uganda work as well. So consider that the snow-capped peak of Mount Kilimanjaro here is called Kibo. And Kibo is thought to be the seat of Iruwa, the paramount god of Chaga ancestors. Students' grandparents, when they themselves were children, so when school students' own grandparents were children, they used to routinely spit in the direction of Kibo to open or start the day. And they would invoke the name and blessing of Iruwa, the ancestral gods who's associated with the top of Kibo. They would invoke Iruwa's blessings when they would celebrate rites of birth, death, initiation, marriage. This very old idea of Kibo as sacred is still present in more everyday forms. Although few people spit to Kibo these days, many still see it as a source of life. Take a look, for example, at 3 statues in this public park located a few blocks away from the school that I just mentioned. Primary school students at, in this case, a private English medium school, designed these statues a few years ago. Each statue depicts a different concept. One shows a student holding a book, standing next to a sign that reads New Millennium. Another child is standing next to a sign that reads New You, which I won't go into right here. And then a third, the third statue, the one I want to focus on here, is of a schoolgirl pointing in the direction of Mount Kilimanjaro, and specifically pointing to the snow-capped peak Kibo. In gesturing toward Kibo, this new environment statue channels an old form of religious knowledge into everyday life. And I corroborated this with folks in the area too. I mean, it was one of the first things I surmised, but this is also Chaga, Tanzanian interpretations as well. Here, Chaga habits of the heart, that is, ancestral blessings and iruwa, are secularized in relation to the work these school students did in creating this public park. To be sure, students' stewardship of the land and lessons about environment and so on resonates, I would argue, with Christian mores about hard work and simple living and the need to take care of the land. Note that the schoolgirl is not wearing a headscarf. She's not overtly marked, in this case at least as Muslim, which as a default renders her publicly as a Christian student. But iconically, in this statue, religious knowledge of Kibo and Iruwa is secularized primarily through a Chaga lens in reference to Kibo and the snow-capped peak. These two examples, then, the teacher's prayer and the new environment statue, begin to give you a sense, I hope, of how religion and education are deeply and subtly entwined in this part of East Africa. So let's take a look next at American evangelicals' work in schools and consider how it layers new meaning and sometimes unforeseen meanings onto already existing secularized and religious forms. So in the next few minutes, I'll tell you a bit about these missionaries' work, and I'll present it in the form of a vignette so you can see part of a typical day. In order to frame American evangelicals' work, we need to understand that these missionaries agreed not to identify themselves as missionaries when they are working in public settings, but they are permitted by Tanzanian official education rules to use the Old Testament in public schools to teach English language lessons. Why? Why can they use the Old Testament? They're allowed to do so because, as Tanzanians see it, and as I've hopefully just given you some illustration, religion is a part of public life, and the Old Testament contains stories that, many argue, are known and believed by both Christians and Muslims, the two main groups of students in public schools. One of the public schools where missionaries work is located off a busy street in the regional capital. One day around 7:30 in the morning, a group of American missionaries arrived to teach English to Tanzanian students. This is the slide you saw earlier, and so I'll just give you the background to it. They gathered in the courtyard where most of the school students were assembled. Actually, this is the playing field, so I'm showing you an image that doesn't quite, is not exactly what I'm describing, but they gathered together, and the headmistress instructed Tanzanian students to sing that Father Ibrahim song. American missionaries who had taught English at this school the previous year had taught this song to grade 5 or standard 5 students. And enthusiastically and rather dutifully, the Tanzanian students burst forth singing in English at the top of their lungs. I'm going to say the song, I'm not going to sing it, but you can sing it if you like from music. This is Father Ibrahim song, and the song is Father Ibrahim has 7 sons, and it's actually Ibrahim, not Abraham that they're using, Ibrahim. Father Ibrahim has 7 sons, and 7 sons has Father Ibrahim. I am one of them, and so are you, so let's all praise the Lord. So students threw their left hands into an imaginary circle in front of them and shouted left hand at the end of the first stanza. They shouted left hand, right hand at the end of the second stanza, and by the end of all 6 stanzas, they had shouted left hand, right leg, head, body, and had shaken all of these body parts into the middle of the circle in turn. It was unusual, the kind of enthusiasm that students displayed and the kind of activity this was very different from the rather quiet classrooms that most of the instruction goes on, where most of the instruction goes on. Their headmistress was pleased that these students were speaking English. She had tried to introduce English as the language of instruction at this primary school, thinking that English would help her students get jobs. But the Tanzanian ministry required that except for this program, she had to continue using Kiswahili as the national language of instruction, or as the language of instruction. Kiswahili is the national language of Tanzania. The missionaries were college students. Most were from Christian colleges in Texas and Tennessee. Some were preparing for careers in evangelism, but most had come to fulfill service learning requirements and to teach English to young Tanzanians, not to go into the ministry eventually. 2 or 3 were preparing to do that, but most were coming to speak English and see a bit of the world. Their reasons for teaching English were similar to those of the Tanzanian headmistress as well. They wanted to help poor students gain future employment. With Tanzanians' permission, these missionaries integrated Bible stories with academic lessons. When the primary school students settled down after singing on this particular day, one missionary stepped forward and divided students into 6 groups of roughly equal numbers. One missionary moved with each group to one of 6 activities. This particular day's lesson was about numbers. That is about how to, it was about an English lesson, a lesson about how to count using English, taught using the Bible creation story. At the reading center, one missionary read the creation story in English and then asked students to read various sentences aloud. The story went generally like this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. On the first day, God said, "Let there be light." On the second day, God made the sky. On the third day, God created dry land, and so on through 7 days of the creation, using the story as a means to teach numbers. When a certain time had passed, students in this group moved to a different center. The pink flamingos, the missionaries had given each of the student groups a color animal name. The pink flamingos moved from the reading center to the conversation center, where they practiced a dialogue involving numbers. The students then moved to the art center, where each received construction paper with 7 doors cut into it. Students numbered the doors 1 through 7 and drew the day's creation episode under each door. Next, they moved to the drama center, where they enacted the days of creation. And I don't have a picture of that, but this is a drama center on the day when they were studying animals using the Noah's Ark story. And so we have 2x2 animals here, and the drama center illustrating that. And last, on this day that I'm narrating, students moved to the games center, where they learned a game involving counting. Now, parents at the school, Christian and Muslim alike, generally supported the English program, although with qualification. One Muslim parent whose daughter attended the program said, "English gives light, mwanga, to my child, but missionaries should not insist on Bible reading. Doing so can cause conflict between Muslims and Christians." A particular teacher at the school, whose child also participated in this English language program, argued that although as a Christian parent she liked the program, she could see why Muslim parents would withdraw their children, would take their children out of the program. Muslims, she said, are afraid that their children will become attracted to the missionaries. Muslim parents don't want their kids singing Christian songs, as she put it. It makes no good relationship in public. When questioned off school grounds, parents and teachers were even more critical of the missionaries' program. One parent said, "They want to steal our children and make them into Europeans. The missionaries are like witches in our village. They make our children turn against us." This was people who were around within earshot laughed at this description, because witchcraft and sorcery are to have been put aside, especially in arenas involving church and school. Others recognized that this parent used witchcraft as a metaphor for characterizing the controversies and hidden implications of these missionaries' work. Some Muslim groups considered these American missionaries to be a proxy for the U.S. war on terror. This opinion was voiced in print in an Islamic weekly that described the use of religious curricula and American missionaries' presence in Tanzanian schools as, quote, part of President George Bush's plan to fight terrorism in East Africa by introducing evangelical Christianity. In Tanzania, where the missionaries work, the politics of language and religion are significant. In this particular school, the East African Muslim Welfare Society had owned the school where these missionaries were teaching. The Muslim Welfare Society was a regional organization formed in the 1940s to promote economic and educational opportunities for Muslims. Nationalized in the 1960s, the school at this time and to the present now belongs to the Ministry of Education and is public. But in the context of international calls for public-private partnerships in the education arena, including these calls coming from the World Bank and UNESCO, some Muslim leaders associated with this school have called for its return to Muslim ownership. One of the classrooms where missionaries taught English had been the Muslim Society's madrasa hall, where students used to recite prayers and where adult members held ibadah, Friday services. Were missionaries, in fact, trying to convert students? Were they drawing them into a U.S. worldview? In teaching children English, a language most students' parents do not know, were missionaries trying to influence and change Tanzanian society? These were the questions that Tanzanians asked, and they were also questions to which missionaries had clear answers when they were off of school grounds, when they were able to speak about their missionizing work. Yes, they said, they did hope to convert students, and yes, they did hope to connect them, not so much with sort of U.S. culture and so on, but with an international economy that was, in these student missionaries' minds, connected to, but not solely driven by American markets. Most missionaries had no idea of Tanzanian parents' concerns. They were interested in using biblical narratives as a backdrop to teach English and thus to lay an implicit religious worldview as the foundation for building public education and for engaging with students off campus, which they were able to do about religious matters. So most missionaries although only one missionary spoke Kiswahili, and a lot of the sort of background conversation and discussions that were had among teachers and parents were not, missionary students were not aware of the debates and discussions about their work that others were having. Yet in addition to Africans' concerns about evangelical missionaries' work dovetailing with U.S. policy, some East Africans also expressed concerns about missionaries' work with children and missionaries' lack of knowledge about Africa and colonial history. One Ugandan, going to the site in Uganda, one Ugandan asked that I return to the United States and tell American students and friends that they need to learn more about African history. I feel like I should do that in every venue that I can. Some Ugandan evangelists working with these missionaries described American evangelism as a form of neocolonialism and American evangelists as people who just did not know history at all. Indeed, East African churchgoers made explicit connections among religion, education, social inequalities, and politics, and several saw the missionaries' work as extending Americans' economic control over Africans. As one Ugandan church member put it, and a Ugandan member within the churches that these missionaries are working, Americans, he said, use their money to divide and rule. Sometimes they say that where there is American money, there should be American leadership. But if funding came directly to Ugandans, we could pay Ugandan evangelists a living wage instead of paying senior missionaries the equivalent of $75,000 annually, which is apparently what they get. Funding, this Ugandan suggested, polarized the church. It turned the Americans, he said, quote, into masters and Ugandans into slaves, end quote. Like other evangelists, other Ugandan evangelists within these, the churches that American missionaries are working, like other African evangelists, he wanted Ugandans to run and manage the church's projects, its schools, health clinic, and in Uganda, its internet cafe. He described the problem of American management as one of, quote, fostering dependency. American missionaries working in East Africa don't want church projects to develop fast. They want their own children to come back, and they want the African church to grow at a very slow rate. This Ugandan evangelist's colleague, argued, quote, American missionaries are not transparent. This is especially true of the young men who come. They are just making up their life, he said, meaning that they are not thinking clearly or planning rationally, but are inventing a strategy as they go. And he continued, quote, if things grow slowly, if the work of the church progresses poorly in Africa, missionaries will have an excuse to keep returning. As it is, new cohorts of missionaries reinvent the wheel instead of starting where their parents left off. So this generational imagery, I'm going to sort of digress a little bit here before I come back to the implications of my research for various audiences, but this generational imagery of father and son reveals, arguably, cultural ideas about patrilineality, whereas the American missionaries sometimes accused the East African evangelists within this church of nepotism and of employing family members within the church and school. The East Africans accused the Americans of doing as much themselves in passing authority from fathers to sons. Let me say there's a lot of common ground. These are points of difference. The overarching sort of belief and faith is something that they share in all working within this church. But it's a mistake to see that it's all of a single piece. There are different views, and East African evangelists, educated abroad in some cases, and in Nairobi at the Bible College, are fairly critical of what they see as some of the reproduction of power that has occurred through a series of father-son missionary groups in this area. So on the face of it, these ethnographic details may seem parochial. They may appear to be representative of only a handful of missionaries working in particular schools in particular places. But to return to the data that I cited earlier and to look at an additional figure before I sum up, between 1992 and 2001, the number of U.S. missionaries working internationally increased by about 16%, and financial support was up during that time, 1992 to 2001, by about 45%. EMIS, the Evangelical and Missions Information Service, whose survey research documents these changes, notes that during these years, a shift occurred away from Bible preaching, sort of direct kind of proselytizing, toward education projects and education programs and development projects. So the kinds of work that the mission groups that they were tracking changed from pure sorts of preaching to engaged activity in schools and elsewhere. EMIS, based at the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton College in Illinois, observes that changes continue to occur. More and more U.S. missions are involved in providing Africans with health care, family planning, and education. To be sure, foreign missions provide social services that state programs in Africa sometimes or very often cannot fund. As I said earlier at the beginning, the smaller role of African states and the greater presence of NGOs has helped to position U.S. missionaries as key social service providers. But are American evangelical missionaries, as Nicholas Kristof says, are they America's new foreign policy force? Are religious NGOs a substitute for governmental diplomacy? This question requires more than a yes-no answer. My research suggests that it's impossible to lump all evangelical missionaries into a single group. The summer students whom I described above are not involved or do not think themselves involved in foreign policy work. Yet some missionaries, particularly those associated with these churches who are living in Nairobi, have contracted to work with American embassies and in Jinja, Uganda, have worked with U.S. congressional representatives to secure consulting contracts in the East African region, particularly around the energy industry. The delivery of educational services through faith-based organizations can be, to say the least, complex, particularly when there is so much intolerance and tension among believers. Yet answering the question, are religious NGOs a substitute for governmental diplomacy, can be addressed in part by thinking about different audiences in answering this question. From what I see, the case I have described here provides insights into tensions that arise when well-intentioned missionaries overlook the history and culture of fellow African church members and colleagues. It also provides insight for those who work in international development agencies and organizations by illustrating that it is important to recognize that local counterparts are local colleagues, not passive recipients of funding. African colleagues and counterparts are well-educated, well-schooled, and well aware of history, have arguments about history, we should say. They are increasingly, and have been for quite a long time, savvy about making sure that local development aid meets local needs, as a colleague, John Weidman, recently pointed out to me. And for those who may volunteer their time or give money to religious or other NGOs involved in schools and education work, this case suggests that it may be important to consider that resources might be sent directly to in this case, African-run and African-owned agencies with whom donors have direct contact. Alumni networks arguably are great for leveraging these contacts. After all, alumni share collective identity and institutional memory and common ground in many ways. At the same time, it's important, I would argue, to recognize the place of government agencies in providing educational services. The NGO revolution of the late 1990s and this early 21st century, the early 21st century growth of religious NGOs have had different consequences than anticipated. In East Africa, where some groups do associate religious NGOs with U.S. foreign policy, NGOs' work has posed problems for East African governments. Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania have all required religious missions to register with the government, and in some cases, these governments have asked some American evangelical missionaries associated with these churches to leave. An arguably better international development policy is to work through bilateral agencies that do not necessarily represent any one special interest group. Clearly, missions are valuable, not only spiritually for many believers, but for providing much-needed social services, including education in settings where public mass schooling is underfunded. With their grassroots network of programs and churches, arguably, American evangelical missionaries are well-placed to deliver education. Far from being out of date or a thing of the past, they are squarely involved in political, economic changes occurring in contemporary Africa. The question is everyone aware of the implications of their work? What are the implications of their work? What remains to be seen is whether such groups' involvement is a local high watermark or if it continues to grow, and if so, how. The trend has been upward across the previous decade. Which direction it continues to move is an important question that needs to be further researched. Thank you. Now, what's interesting is when it comes to education, more girls than boys are going to secondary school, and I'm not talking about tertiary at this point, but so there's, in a sense, a patrilineal disfavor to boys when it comes to education. The argument is that boys will go and find jobs in town and can find their way kind of fairly quickly after primary school. Girls are seen as sort of needing to be kept closer to home, and so the parents are more inclined to send daughters than sons to secondary school. That has an interesting sort of payback effect to mothers, because when boys marry, when young men marry, they are considered responsible for their wives and children and their own parents. The wives tend to then be separated from their natal households when they marry. However, an educated daughter who marries and lives sort of locally or with her husband is seen as more likely, and is more likely, to send money back to her natal family. So investing in girls' education is also a way, particularly for women who have, in the main, been the ones paying for school fees. If women invest in their daughters' education, people say, this is an explicit argument, they make an economic argument, I'm actually going to get that money back, or I'm going to get care and protection back, because my educated daughter will take care of me when I'm really old. Yeah. Does that answer part of your question?
Yes. How about the initiation rites? Have they gone, or are they?
They still exist. There have been a lot of NGOs, particularly German-funded NGOs that I'm aware of, that have campaigned against initiation rites. The last I followed them, and I haven't been following them closely recently, because to really to get into those, other than sort of just generic things that people say doesn't exist, you have to live there a long time continuously, and it's a subject that people don't talk about openly and very easily. So the last I followed it, the initiation rites for both girls and boys happened. For boys, initiation rites happen openly. I mean, people will talk about that. They happen in a house, and a medical doctor and so on is associated with that ritual. Girls, as I say, the last that I followed it was really kind of secret and not open. There was no medical facility that helped them, and the lessons were. People said the lessons had been passed down from generation to generation.
Having the resources given to missionaries directed to African groups to educate and perform these other important services, do you feel like there are enough African groups and teachers available to perform this work, or do you think that transition to Africans is farther off and more difficult?
I think one has to look for those connections, and really I think it was probably a quick comment that I made that might have needed a little bit more thought, but generally one-to-one sort of direct investment with people, programs that one knows have a greater effect, and that's what I hear Africans telling me as well. Of course, not all of us, not everyone has direct contact, and so we go through intermediary groups, but what we do see on the ground in Africa, or parts where I've worked in Africa, and generally here with international organizations, talking about other international organizations, those funds are not generally as directly used as are those that go person to person or directly invested in a local organization. I mentioned alumni networks. I mean, when you think about it, but what Ugandans were telling me is like, we're educated. We really have a big picture of what's going on, and if there's been 30 or more years in this particular church of discussion about making African churches independent. In fact, I went to the Billy Graham archives and looked at the archives from the 70s of these churches, and they're talking about devolving power to Africans and creating independent churches and getting rid of missionaries. And 30, 40 years later, the missionaries are still there. So there's a long history of trying to create independent organizations, and Africans in this church were saying we are independent. We can be a lot more independent if things were to come directly to us.
Increased missionary presence has impacted or influenced HIV education about transmission and prevention in Tanzania.
Well, really, that's a question that requires research, and I haven't myself conducted research on that exactly. I can give you some examples of work that I'm aware of, particularly in Uganda, of through PEPFAR and other, maybe even somebody here may know more than I am, and so I would just defer to you, but there's been a lot of religious organization support for particular U.S. programs going through the government and going through USAID to advocate for particular kinds of family planning. Abstinence only was the big sort of model that PEPFAR was using under the Bush administration. That's actually changed now, but there was a indirect but traceable connection between U.S. evangelicals, some within these churches, ideas about family planning, and connections between ideals here, funding streams, and programs, HIV/AIDS awareness programs and abstinence-only programs in Uganda. And I have a colleague, Nancy Kendall, who is working on this very project, and I would recommend her work as a place to go to look specifically for that kind of stuff.
You mentioned that the missionaries, when they're getting trained, they get some anthropological education, and I was just wondering, what exactly are they taught?
Yeah, there's apparently a whole literature out there on, and I stumbled across this when I was at some of these colleges in Texas and in Tennessee. I visited bookstores, the bookstores, and no, actually, I knew this was the case because missionaries told me they studied anthropology, but I came across the literature that they were reading and teaching in their classes. Anthropology for Christian Witness is one book, and it's actually put out by Catholic presses. Sorry, I can't remember the author's name off the top of my head, but there's a whole way of thinking about anthropology and participant observation as analogous to what these missionaries call the Jesus mode of teaching, right? Engaging with people and sort of learning the way of life through actual participant observation. And so some of the language is very familiar between the anthropology that is likely taught, the kind that's taught at Pitzer, and the kind of anthropology or the way anthropology is taught at a Christian college. Some of it is very familiar, but some of it is very, very foreign to me, having sort of been disciplined literally in through anthropology. One of the differences is an idea that biblical culture exists as a perfect form. And there's even a sense in these churches, in fact, one of the missionaries, and this is in one of the chapters in the book, one of the missionaries did a master's thesis at a college where he was looking at Luo culture, and I'm going to forget the exact details, but he was looking at sort of how close or distant Luo culture in Uganda, Kenya, Western Kenya, is from ideas of biblical sacrifice, for instance. So there's a perfect ideal, this is where the literalist version of the Bible comes in, the perfect vision that the Bible embodies, and missionaries want to sort of see how close or far groups are from it. There's even a kind of evangelism that Winters, I forget the first name, an author by the name of Winters has a scheme that is still like a mnemonic device that evangelists use to think about how they're going to engage with different kinds of communities. It's called the E1 to E3 evangelism. There's a whole sort of argument about how to best evangelize those distant cultures, who and how should evangelize those cultures. These kinds of ideas that missionaries have about how they studied anthropology, or how some of the students did study mission anthropology, as they say, it's totally unknown to the East Africans with whom they're working. Even the Ugandans, I don't, oh, actually, no, Nairobi Bible College, they teach a version of this mission anthropology to some of the African evangelists. I didn't
What
get
about the difference between the Islamic and the Christian response from the Africans? Because they would neither of them object to the religion.
No,
as such,
exactly.
But to specific matters of symbolism and so on.
Right, exactly. That's right. That's why so many Muslim parents were okay with this religious message. It was the mode or the subtle Christian way, you know, the praise the Lord at the end of Father Ibrahim's song that signaled subtly this is in fact a Christian orientation to the story. I think that I don't have as close contacts or connections or understanding of the Muslim communities in this area, so I don't have as much to go on. But generally, that the many Muslim parents were you know, supportive and encouraged their students to go. So you saw that there were some Muslim students involved in the project. Can you ask you why you were asking this question?
I would have assumed that,
Yeah.
that then there would be a resistance to education itself just because it came in a Christian mode, which is the unfortunate fallout from this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is, at the same time that this mission group was starting its program in the public schools, there was a new school funded, a vocational school for Muslim students, funded, I'm not sure, actually externally, it wasn't funded from within East Africa, an Islamic mission funded school that was then free of charge to Muslims. So you can sort of get a selection effect out of the public schools for those who feel really very uncomfortable with the backdrop of Protestant Christianity that remains in the public, and in the whole sort of governmental system as well. There's a whole connection that many critics of contemporary politics and government will see as the connection between mission schools, civil service, and independent groups, independent politics.
Thank you very much. There's time to continue questions
Okay.
outside during reception. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.